Hi everybody, thanks for joining us. Today we really want to take you through the fundamentals of good property investment. And it's surprising to me that these things are often not well known by most of the people who invest in property, and as a consequence, often they don't have the sort of outcome that they are expecting. So to take you through today, my name's Evan Thornley. He's Mark Brilliant. Welcome.
Hi. Thanks, Evan.
Mark leads our team that helps people professionally purchase properties in a really astute way. What we're going to do today is start with some actual case studies of 4 investors who bought a property 10 years ago at about the same price and then all sold last year, 10 years later. And I think what you'll see is quite shocking. There's a significant difference in the outcome for people, and possibly the properties that you might have thought had been the best investments may not have been. So Mark, do you want to take us through?
Thanks, Evan. So the first property we're going to highlight here today is number 11 Olive Grove in Pascoe Vale. It's a brick home, 1980s construction. There's nothing particularly flash about it. It's really just a good, honest first home buyer's home. It's crying out for a good update and renovation. It's got a small backyard, nothing too big, but it's a really decent little family home in a good, quiet street in Pascoe Vale, close to shops and schools and to some parks as well. So really good for a young couple or a young family. Second home, 3 at 1 to 3 in Glen Ebor Avenue, Blackburn. An amazing location for people that know Blackburn. This property is just a few hundred metres walk to Blackburn Lake, and also just a couple of hundred metres to Blackburn train station and to the shopping village, which is just so convenient and ever improving. A lovely townhouse, 2 stories.
I always think of this is like the middle, isn't it?
Very much so.
It's a middle class home in a middle ring suburb, good honest family home, good location.
That's right, yeah. And this particular one had a really decent sized courtyard for a townhouse, had a lovely alfresco dining area out the back, and you could actually see across the back fence looking out over the football oval. Really peaceful and quiet area, but very conveniently located. So it was really about, for young couples, retirees, even investors, it was all about location with Glen Ebor Avenue. Now, moving on to Windsor, 304 at 233 Dandenong Road in Windsor. Now, 10 years ago when they bought this property, Evan, it was a brand new...
snazzy apartment.
Yeah,
right?
That's right.
Inner city suburb.
Hey, Windsor, I mean, it was 800 metres to Chapel Street, to Windsor train station. It was purchased brand new off the plan, so there was some significant stamp duty and also tax benefits in buying...
European appliances, the whole...
Absolutely,
shebang.
yeah, that's right. And look, this particular apartment as well, what I do like about it is top floor, really decent outlook and views, plenty of natural light. It's got quite a lot going for it for the tenants or for the owner-occupiers alike. And young people, students, young couples wanting that inner city vibe and lifestyle. Really, really well-positioned property.
Easy to let. Yeah.
Absolutely. There's always plenty of tenants for these kind of properties. So, and again, being brand new, it had significant benefits from a tax perspective as well. So, the fourth property we've got, apartment 18 at 43 Caroline Street in South Yarra. Evan, one of the
that's a blue chip location.
Yeah.
If ever, Caroline Street, South Yarra, one of the prestige streets in Melbourne.
Yeah, that doesn't get much better than that. And again, just a few hundred metres to Toorak Road, South Yarra train station.
Faulkner Park, the Tan.
Yeah, it's all there. The Yarra, I mean, you're so close to the city. I mean, you can literally walk to the city. I mean, it's an amazing location.
Older style apartment, but big and light.
Again, top floor. So middle floor, but elevated, natural light, floor to ceiling windows. So a really decent for an apartment in an amazing location. So they're our 4 properties. They were all purchased for around about the same sort of money in the mid-3s, back about 10 years ago in 2009-10.
So Mark's done a really good job of impersonating a real estate sales agent there.
Thanks, Evan.
Telling you the types of things that people get sold these properties on, and that's why these 4 investors bought all 4 of these properties for reasons that Mark's made pretty clear.
Yeah.
What I think is startling is when you then see what actually happened over the next 10 years. Which of these properties ended up being very good investments? Which of them ended up being surprisingly poor investments? And how big is the difference between them? So let's look at this actual case study, these 4 investors and what happened. But just before we do, why don't you take a few moments to think about which of these properties do you think would have been the best and the worst performers, and how much difference do you think it would make after 10 years? You've spent somewhere in the sort of 350 to 390 range. 10 years later, hopefully some of them, hopefully all of them, would have been worth a lot more than that after 10 years. What do you think they might be worth now, and which ones do you think might have done better or worse? So just review them and have a thought for yourself, and then we're going to share what actually happened in the real world. So you can see these properties all started out somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 10 years ago, and you can see them laying out there now. And then look what happened. This is, I think, pretty startling. It's pretty arresting. You can see now, one of those properties went from 350 to 930 in 10 years. 2.5 times your money. Absolutely shot the lights out. A fantastic investment.
Yeah.
One of them, Mark, that one's actually gone down, hasn't it? 390 to 375. So lost $15,000 over 10 years.
Unfortunately, yeah. And that was the Windsor property, which
The snazzy new European appliance apartment.
brand new, would have been sold with, a lot of the benefits of
Lots of froth
buying,
and bubble, but
buying new and all the benefits that come with that. But unfortunately, you can see that, and this is a pretty common snapshot of what
probably
happened.
the one that surprised me was I would have thought Caroline Street, South Yarra, that property would have done better. A good, solid, older style apartment.
Yeah. Certainly a bit disappointing there as well.
I mean, they've made money. They've made 60 or 70,000 over the 10 years, but nothing like the money that the owners made on Olive Grove or on our middle property.
Glen
And,
Ebor, exactly right. And
just good solid middle ring suburb, good solid middle class home.
I think that's the thing, Evan. Neither of those two properties that have performed particularly well are very flash properties. There was nothing amazing about them. They on the surface of it, they're really just your average properties in your average suburbs.
Yeah.
But they had some fundamentals that we'll talk about.
And that's what I think we need to get onto, because I think if there's any lesson from this, you don't do property investing with your eyes. It's not what you look at that tells you whether something's a good property. And so now we want to take you through what we think are the fundamental drivers. And we'll come back to this case study, to Mark's case study at the end, and you'll see how those drivers actually played out and why this outcome was actually quite predictable if you understand how the property market values properties over time. So let's just take you through what we think are the 5 fundamental drivers that you must understand to decide which investment property to buy. Okay, so these are the 5 key drivers of long-term capital growth for investment properties. We'll talk about some in a bit more detail than others, but you always have to start with population growth, because that's the first thing that has to be happening. If there's a growing population, there's a greater need for housing. The housing that exists becomes more scarce. Demand grows faster than supply. Prices go up.
Yeah.
We won't talk a lot about that one today, because all of Melbourne is subject to long-term population growth. And in fact, this has been why Melbourne's been such a great market, Mark, for the last 3 decades, really.
Absolutely.
Has been, Melbourne's been growing at about 2.3% per annum in population. May not sound a lot, but it's faster than almost any other major city in the developed world. Obviously, there's some cities in the developing world growing very quickly, but London, Los Angeles, lots of places that you would think were perhaps fast growing. Melbourne has outpaced them all. It's outpaced Sydney. And so, when you've got an MCG and a quarter of people moving to your city every year, that is always going to drive strong property growth. Now, as you get down to, a smaller set of locations, the population growth has not been even, and there's a range of factors that drive that. But we're not going to talk more about population growth today. If we were considering different regional cities, this would be a very important driver. But really, all of Melbourne is getting the wash of population growth over it. And apart from what is going to be a serious hiccup due to COVID in 2020, 21, 22, we think that long-term trend of population growth will continue. And that's one of the core reasons why Melbourne will continue to be an outstanding investment market. If you come away from this webinar with one lesson, Mark, I reckon this is it. 4 words. Land appreciates buildings depreciate.
Depreciate.
That's the most fundamental lesson in property investment, and it's one that's not well understood and frankly not widely promoted by most of the people in the real estate industry or the development industry, because it doesn't necessarily suit their purposes to do so. But if you think about it, it makes sense. There's a fixed amount of land. As they always say at the auctions, they're not making any more of it. There's a greater population. So the demand for that land is increasing, the supply is staying the same, therefore land values continue to go up. Now, in the next section, section 3, we'll talk about some land appreciates faster than others, and we'll talk about how you can pick which types of land. But the first fundamental thing is you want most of the money that you're spending on an investment property effectively to be buying land.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Because the building itself, no matter how beautiful it is, in fact, particularly if it's beautiful, it's like a beautiful new car. It's worth 20% less the day you drive it off the lot with a new car. It's not quite that dramatic with a new house or apartment, but the value of the building only goes down. It looks worse, it gets tired, it needs maintenance. So the more of your money that's gone to pay for a snazzy building, that portion of your money is going to be shrinking. The portion of your money that's paying for the underlying land, whether it's a share of the land in an apartment or in a standalone home or a townhouse, that portion of your money is going to grow. And so the good property investments are always driven by good land content, where a good portion of your money goes into land, and the land that you bought is going to accelerate rapidly, or more rapidly than other land that is not as favourable. So it's a bit of an abstract concept, land content, but I'll just give you a simple example. Let's imagine you bought a property for $400,000. But the value of the land, if it had been an empty block of land, was perhaps only $100,000. Maybe this is in a regional city somewhere, and there's a home on it with $300,000 worth of new building. Well, then your $100,000 worth of land will grow, hopefully, certainly if there's population growth. But your $300,000 worth of building,
it's depreciating. It's
right.
It's getting older. It's starting to need
I think the tax department says it depreciates 2.5% per annum. So it has a life of about 40 years. That's not crazy. Odd for the tax department to get things right, but you know that's probably a reasonable rule of thumb. So your $300,000 building is losing a few percent per year. Hopefully your land is growing by more than that. But in this example, there isn't a lot of land there. So the land content, as we call it, that's how we calculate it, isn't it, Mark?
Yeah.
Is what proportion of your money went into the land. In this case, it was only a quarter, 25%, 100,000 out of the total 400,000. The next example you can see is a very different outcome, where this is perhaps an older home, perhaps on a larger suburban block. The vast majority of the money here is effectively paying for the land. There's an old depreciated building on it, and so most of your money is going into the growing asset, which is the land, not into the shrinking asset, which is the building. And so dramatically different land content. Now, this is for the more mathematically inclined among you, but and freeze the frame if you want to look at the numbers. They're not as complicated as they appear. All we're doing is taking those very two examples we just went through, the property with 1/4 of the money in the land and the property with 80% of the money in the land. And if you can imagine that the land typically goes up, let's say by 8% per annum, which good land can do, but the buildings decrease in value by 2.25% per annum, then you can see that the value of the land increases rapidly, the value of the buildings decreases gradually. Dramatic impact in the value of those two properties, both bought for $400,000, but one of them's worth $750,000 in 10 years, and one of them's sort of crawled its way up to about 450. So that's a mathematical example of kind of what you showed in your...
What we were looking at before with the chart, that's right. It's starting to show that, you know, purchase for the same price, but the land component is ultimately showing that they're 10 years later in a very, very different position.
And actually, if we go now to the examples that Mark gave before. So Mark, here we are, and guess what? Land content looks like a really good explanation of what we saw on the graph before.
It's a direct reflection, Evan. You know, starting with Olive Grove in Pascoe Vale, 515 square metres, a 75% land to asset ratio. So 75%
of your money went into the dirt.
Went into the dirt, and that's the fundamental
Didn't
key.
pay a lot for that house. It was 30 years old. It was pretty tired.
That's right. It's 40 years old now. It's even more tired,
Right.
but the land is continuing
up
to
and
go and up. And like you said, they're not making any more of it. And Pasco Vale has come along in leaps and bounds, and it's a very popular area now for young families. And the land is worth quite a bit. So Glen Ebor Avenue, the townhouse there, we've calculated at 137 square metres, around about 50% of
So
the
fairly small land, but
Yeah.
well-located land.
well-located land, and it's reflected in the result. You know, Pasco Vale was a really strong achiever. Glen Ebor Avenue was a pretty medium,
Solid, yeah.
solid achiever with an
Bought for 360 odd, sold for 670.
Yep.
Nothing wrong with that.
That's
after
exactly
10
right.
years.
Now the challenge with the other two properties are that they're both apartments, and so you know the vast majority of the money is going into the building.
Yeah.
In
How
particular,
do you even calculate the land content?
so well, what we do is we look at the overall size of
Of
the
the
block,
total block that
total
it
block.
sits on.
That's right. So you know, with Dandenong Road, you know, I think it was around about a 1,300 square metre block, and you divide that by the 40 odd apartments that were
Right.
there. And you end up with a 34 square metre share
Right,
of
of the
land.
dirt, yeah.
Which is not a lot.
Yeah.
And so hence that only 22% of the purchase price was actually buying any component of land, and it's not even
Right.
your land, it's it's owned a corporation
Yeah.
land, it's land that you're sharing with everybody
And
else.
the other, almost 80% of your money goes into the snazzy apartment.
Brand
and
new.
The European appliances and all those things that are worth a lot less 10 years
They're
later.
all 10 years old,
Yeah.
they're all
It's
starting
not a
to
big
need-
market for 10-year-old Miele appliances, let's face it.
There's not. Well,
Yeah.
that's, you know, they're out of warranty and they're starting to break down, and,
Yeah.
and now it's costing you money as an owner rather than making you any money. So, and it was a similar situation with Caroline Street in South Yarra. It was around about 35% land. to
Right, a
our
little
share.
bit better though, so smaller block, smaller number
Smaller
of
number of
apartments, bigger
apartments.
block of land.
Yeah.
So more of your money went into the land and the building was older, so you definitely did better.
And
I
better
mean,
land too. I mean, Caroline Street, South Yarra is better land than Dandenong Road, Windsor.
Yep.
So, and it had a fractionally better result because of that. So,
Right. So we've definitely seen a complete correlation then in this example, and we could give you hundreds of others.
we just see this
Of-
repeating day after day.
Land content is a huge driver of long-term capital growth for the reason that we've discussed. But not all land is created equal, and that's what brings us to the third point, which is about the scarcity value of the land. Because some land will appreciate very quickly, some land will appreciate only modestly. Pretty much all land will continue to appreciate, but you'd rather be on a fast train than a slow train. So let's talk about scarcity value. Scarcity is a difficult concept to explain quickly, I think, but the way I like to think about it is there something unusually good about this block of land and its location that isn't shared by most of the other land? Is there something special about it? So, is it close to a train station? You'd rather walk to the station 5 minutes than walk for 20 minutes, particularly on a cold Tuesday night when it's raining. Clearly, that's something that you would prefer to have. Now, there's not that many properties within a 5-minute walk of a station. We've got this example here, Mount Waverley. There's only about 400 properties in total, whether they're houses, apartments, the whole shooting match, within a 5-minute walk of Mount Waverley Station. And yet, there's no one who would prefer to be 20 minutes walk from the station than 5 minutes walk from the station. No homeowner, not their kids that want to get to school or into the city, not
Tenants.
their tenants. Everybody would rather have a 5-minute walk to the station than a 20-minute walk, but not that many properties have that quality. So we would say that this location is unusually good. It's scarce.
Yes.
There's only a small number of properties that are a 5-minute walk from the station. In fact, when you look at it, just the circle gets bigger. 20 minutes walk from Mount Waverley Station, there's 4,500 properties. So there's a lot of them, and yet less people want them. The properties that everyone wants, 5 minutes walk from the station, there's only 400 of them. So there's more than 10 times less properties and more people want them. So you can imagine that a block of land or a piece of land in that location is going to appreciate faster than a piece of land in a less attractive location. It's scarcity. I mean, we see the same thing, Mark. I mean, close to the beach is the classic
Beaches,
example.
yeah, I mean, that's right.
Yeah.
I mean, you're either beachfront or you're 500 metres back and it's still only a short walk, but then you're a kilometre and 2 kilometres, and you might as well be 10 kilometres because then you've got to drive to the beach, and you're not near the beach.
And so 10 years ago, a bit of beachfront land might have been worth double the value per square metre as something a kilometre away. Now it's probably worth triple.
Yeah.
So the difference keeps growing because there are more and more people who want to be near that beach, and they're not making any more. There's no more land. So the demand outstrips the supply, and it pushes the prices up more rapidly. So scarcity of location is about those things which are unusually good, whether it's proximity to public transport or to a beach or a park or a particular view.
School zones are very...
School zones, classic example. There's only a certain number of homes within McKinnon School Zone or Glen Waverley Secondary College School Zone. So it's those things which are unusually good that not many properties have that mean that the land content of those properties appreciates even faster than the land content of properties which are just kind of the same as everybody else's
Ticking
land.
along, that's right.
It's all okay, but there's nothing special or unusually good about it. So scarcity is a key driver to how fast the land appreciates. Number 4 on our list is another one of the things that you can't see by looking at the property, and yet can have a profound impact on the capital appreciation of the property. Mark, can you take us through? You're much better at this than me.
Yeah, no worries.
Development potential. You've got some examples here you were looking at recently.
Yeah, these are 3 sort of quite current, recent examples that we've been looking at for clients of ours, and these properties here...
on the face of it, all look kind of similar.
They're all pretty basic, 1950s, just honest sort of 3-bed, 1-bathroom homes, but it's not about the houses, it's about the actual land that they're sitting on. And these houses here...
The land is, again, the land content is about the same.
They're all roughly the same, 590, 626 and 600 square metres. So we've tried to find examples that are effectively the same amount of land. They're all within about 800, 900 metres of each other.
Same sort of lifestyle.
So you're going to the same school, you're going to the same shops, you're walking to the same train station, you're going to the same park.
Okay. So what's scarce about one versus the other? They seem...
Absolutely.
Why is one unusually good compared to the others?
That's right. And so the first one, if you look there, it's in the zone that we call the residential growth zone. And so it's this one is an area where the council and the government, it's fractionally closer to the shops and the trains, and they encourage high density development. So on that block of land there, you could comfortably do up to squeeze 5 or 6 townhouses.
Right.
You can go to 3 levels where...
put a dozen apartments.
You could do apartments.
Right.
It's quite common in these areas to see 2 blocks get put together, so 2 owners come together, and they sell off their 1,300 square metres for a huge 30 or 40 apartment development site with basement car parks and all that kind of thing.
But you can only do that in that zone.
You can only do it in that zone.
And there's only a small amount of land that has that zoning versus the other?
Well, it comes back to your scarcity as well, Evan, because there'd only be a couple of hundred properties in and around that area that can have that development potential.
And that's why it's dramatically more valuable already.
Significantly, yeah, nearly 50% more in one case per square metre, because it's got that potential, and developers will pay for that potential because they can get the return.
Right. But what about the other 2 though? Because they're both the same zoning.
Yeah.
And yet one's worth, looks like, about 20% more per square metre.
That's right. So these are the general residential, which is where some development is allowed. It's generally townhouse development where you could, on a typical block like this of around
2 or 3 villas or
2 or
something
3
like that,
townhouses or villas, that's right. However, the fundamental key with 73 Northumberland Road is that it's actually a corner site.
Right.
Now, with a corner, you don't have to have... With a traditional block of land, you need a long driveway down the side to service your 3 villas.
Yeah.
But with a corner, you can have your 3 driveways...
People coming in from both streets.
From the side,
right.
That's right. And in fact, you can often squeeze an extra one on because you're not wasting all that land with driveways.
On driveways, right.
So instead of being able to do 3, perhaps you can do 4. The yield for a developer is a lot higher. You can build...
And that's why they're willing to pay 20% more.
Exactly right.
Right.
So same zoning, similar land size, but significantly more valuable.
Right, interesting. So this was our 4th criteria, properties that have development potential. And why is that important? Well, it's scarce. There's only a few properties that are either corner lots or are in particularly high density development zones that the developers will pay more for. So that land is scarcer, it goes up in value more quickly than the land that is more common. So the last of our criteria is kind of a grab bag of a bunch of other things, because you know, we've tried to make this very simple. I mean, we spend, Mark, what, a couple of hundred hours typically helping a client purchase
Absolutely.
a single property,
Yeah.
choosing between hundreds of them to find really the absolute best one. So we can't cover all of that in half an hour. But there are a range of lifestyle factors that obviously do impact the capital growth of the property too. And some of those things change as well. You know, infrastructure goes in, a new hospital goes in, or a new, I think you were talking about Sunshine recently.
Sunshine, with being an employment and a medical cluster as well, so schools, universities, hospitals.
Right,
you know,
and that's bringing more high-income families to that area too, which
Absolutely.
is going to, so that works. Other lifestyle factors. Orientation's one of my favourite. You know, Melbourne is awfully dark and miserable in winter, but if you've got your main living areas facing north, the sun is low in the sky, and it comes in right when you need it in the middle of winter. If your property's facing south, you get none of that, and your place is dark and miserable. So, and by definition, only about 1/4 of homes are facing north. The others are facing in the other three directions. So there's a range of those factors that will also impact the attractiveness and the scarcity of the property, and will have some impact on capital growth. But the bigger drivers in our mind, the population growth overall is an absolutely essential driver, but as we say, across Melbourne, that's a bit of a given, though it has more of an impact in some places than others. But what proportion of your money is going into the land? How scarce that land is, therefore, how quickly will that land appreciate? And particularly, a particular version of scarcity, which is development potential, is something that will drive dramatic increases in value. So I hope for many of you, you've said, well, that's not that hard, guys. I think that makes sense. Maybe that was or wasn't how you understood property investment to work, but hopefully that's given you some real fundamentals. But I want to just share some of the things that people have got wrong, because if you can learn that in half an hour, then why doesn't everyone do that? People get misled by a whole lot of things. The people that bought that property in Dandenong Road, they weren't idiots, and they weren't, you know, it wasn't like there was no good reasons to buy that property. They had good tax advantages, depreciation off the plan without stamp duty and so on. It's just that those benefits didn't count for that much. Numerically, those things were worth thousands, or on a good day, tens of thousands.
And at the time as well.
And seemed like a lot of money, but it's the underlying capital growth that was worth hundreds of thousands, worth ultimately $600,000 more to get the property with the great capital growth. So it's not that you shouldn't be concerned about the tax benefits or the depreciation or any of those things. Those all do matter, and they matter for material amounts of money. They just don't matter as much as long-term capital growth. And the things that drive that are the things you don't notice so easily with your eyes. The land content, the scarcity of the land, the development potential, rather than the snazzy, glamorous, easy things to look at, or the quick tax or depreciation or other benefits that a lot of salespeople focus people's attention on when they should be focused on capital growth. So one of those reasons that often drives people's thinking about which property to buy is what the rental yield will be today. So I like to think of the yield as sort of the interest rate that your property pays you for putting your money into it. And it's an important number. You know, I'd rather get $400 a week than $300 a week if I paid the same amount of money for the property.
Well, most people are borrowing money to buy these properties.
Right, and so they need to pay the mortgage. And so, you know, we talk about the gross yield, which is usually what the real estate agent who's selling the property focuses on, which is what's the total amount of money the tenant pays you. We don't think that's as important a number as what we call the net yield, which is the amount that ultimately ends up in your pocket after you've paid the rates, the insurance, we'll get to your interest in a minute, your property management fees, your maintenance, and all of those other things. So really what matters financially is the net yield that you get, not the total amount the tenants pay, but the total amount left in your pocket, particularly with apartments where there might be very expensive, for example, body corporate fees that make a big difference between the gross yield and the net. So the net yield matters, and you'd rather have a higher net yield than lower, but it's not as important as the capital growth. Mark, just take us through the examples of the properties you picked out before.
Yeah, absolutely. So starting again with Olive Grove, you know, you're only looking at for that house on that much land. You know, you don't get a lot of money for the land. So you know, you're
right. So if you were buying because you wanted to rent it out and you were only going to get 1.8% return on your money renting it out, that doesn't seem as attractive as our friend down in Dandenong Road where you're getting 4%.
Absolutely, and that's very, very typical. And you know, older homes on larger land, generally get a lot lower, sort of around about 2%. Net yield is generally about where they are.
Right.
Newer apartments tend to get higher yields. They're in highly sought after locations.
And that's why people think they're a better investment,
That's
because
right.
they're paying a better return in year one.
That's right.
But that's not the main driver. So if we go to look at the total return of the capital growth and the yield for these properties,
Yeah.
it's a very different picture. Because, I mean, look at it. There's a big difference between the Olive Grove yield and the Dandenong Road yield, but it's about 2% of the value of the property.
That's right.
Whereas we're seeing a 6 or 7% difference in the capital growth. So just do the math. 6 or 7 is a bigger number than 2.
Yeah.
So it matters more.
Yeah. Exactly.
If you look at the total returns, you've got the net yield, the cash you get in your pocket each year, but then you've got the capital growth, which is the big number on the page. So, Mark, I mean, that shows it really clearly, doesn't it?
It's significant, isn't it? I mean, we're talking about 11% versus 3 and even 6.9% in South Yarra.
Well, and actually, Dandenong Road actually had negative capital growth. I mean, they lost money on it.
Yeah.
Right. So the 4% yield sounds great, but if that's all you get, it is, as we say sometimes, the sound of one hand clapping. It's the capital growth is always the big number on the page, and the yield's important because it helps you pay off the mortgage.
And it is the short-term focus. I think a lot of selling agents, when they're talking about these kind of properties,
As investments,
they're selling the yield. They're selling the return that it might be even sometimes cash neutral or slightly negative or slightly positively geared, but they make it an easy buy.
Right. But the capital growth is the real driver, and that's a harder thing to see and understand, and that's why we've made this webinar. Again, the numbers don't lie. I mean, Mark, there you have it, right?
Yeah, it's
okay. Less yield, less depreciation benefits, less blah 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 blah. No European appliances. No one cares.
Yeah,
at 930 grand.
Yeah, I'll take Daggy, Old Olive Grove, Pascoe Vale any day.
All day long.
Yeah, that's right.
Because you bought land content, you bought well-located, scarce land. It's corner lot. It's going to have good development potential, and so you shot the lights out there in.
They did really well.
To the naked eye, just appears to be a standard suburban property.
Yeah, that's right.
Versus a snazzy inner city apartment with European appliances, which unfortunately turned out to be a very poor investment. We're just going to take a few of your questions now, because there was a lot in that, and I think there'll be a number of people who've got some important questions that we'd like to answer for everybody's benefit. So, Ruby, we've got some questions in from the audience.
Sure. So from Kunal, we've got, what do you think are the best suburbs to buy in Melbourne at the moment?
Oh, wow. That's such an important question, Kunal. Mark, we get this all the time, don't we? You don't buy a suburb. Folks, I really want to be clear about this. There's a fascination in the media talking about which is the hot suburb. All the developers and real estate agents try and tell you that their suburb is the hot suburb.
Well, it sells magazines. I mean, just about every property investment magazine that comes out, it's got the top 20 suburbs to buy in, and it's a hot topic.
It's not a helpful thing, and let me explain why. That property in Pascoe Vale was a great property. It made a killing, but we could have shown you some rubbish properties in Pascoe Vale that made no money at all. Okay. You don't buy a suburb, you buy a property. And the land content of that property and how scarce the particular land is that property is on, and its development potential, those are the things that are going to drive the capital growth. Yes, there are some differences over time. Certain suburbs grow faster than others. Suburbs that gentrify and become nicer to live in, have more cafes, pick up, a school becomes better. I'm not saying that the suburb is irrelevant, but I go back to the idea of what's the big number on the page? The big number on the page is the capital growth of the land content of your property. And I think one of the reasons why there's such an emphasis, a false emphasis in our view about you've got to pick the hotspot suburb, is because every real estate agent who's selling a property and every developer who's developing a property tries to sell that property on the basis of allegedly their suburb is a great suburb. But they're not selling you the suburb, they're selling you the property, and in many cases, look, Windsor's a great suburb. I've seen tons of properties in Windsor that have absolutely shot the lights out in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
But that property on Dandenong Road was not one of them. And yet I'm sure many people bought that because they were shown long-term capital growth for Windsor as a suburb.
Yeah, and that's the challenge.
So it's a very reasonable question you asked, Kunal. It's something that many buyers are focused on because they're taken to that focus. But whoever the real estate agent is usually only works in that suburb. So surprise, surprise, they'll tell you it's the best suburb in the world. Somebody's put $10 million into developing a big apartment tower in that suburb. They're going to tell you it's the best suburb in the world. And I'm not going to tell you it's not the best suburb. I'm going to say that's not the most important question. It's the property itself.
We do provide advice about suburbs when we are looking for properties. When a client is looking to buy a new property, we'll assess, given their current portfolio and what they're looking to achieve.
Sure. I mean, when I think of outer suburban properties, new house and land packages, those which are close to the rail corridors are probably going to appreciate more than those which are just all car driven, so if you'll pardon the pun. So we're not saying suburb is unimportant, but it's not the driver of your decision. Next question, Ruby, who else is asking questions?
Sure, so we have Stephanie asking if you can buy a property with both high yield and high capital growth.
Well, that would be the holy grail,
Yes,
Mark.
yeah. It's like the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, isn't it? It's
look, to a certain extent, the market is rational, and so the properties that have very high capital growth, their prices go up quickly, and therefore the rental yield, as a proportion of that value, tends to be lower. So
it lags.
to a fair extent, Stephanie, the two are in conflict. And so for many of our investors and our clients, part of what we want to work through with them is what are your investment objectives, and therefore should we have a bias towards stronger cash yield, rental yield, or should we have a bias towards stronger long-term capital growth? I was talking to a client recently, he and his wife are 75 years old, and their focus right now is on income.
Yeah.
They've worked hard, put money aside, been able to acquire some good assets, both property and other assets, but they need income. So for them, yield really matters, and what the property might be worth 15 or 20 years from now is of less concern to them. But for most property investors, property is a long-term game. That's why we've called long view. We like to look at it in the long view. The bigger financial outcome is going to be driven by the capital growth, but that will require you to buy a property that in most cases will have a lower yield. And so, of course, that makes it harder to repay if there's a big mortgage. So you can only fit your financial parameters. And Mark, I mean, you obviously sit down with a client and work through, well, how much can they afford to pay on the mortgage?
That's right.
And therefore, how much can they afford to borrow? And then, within that budget, how can we find a property that's going to get the best capital growth we can?
That's right.
Within the constraints of needing some yield to help pay the mortgage.
Exactly right.
Yeah. Okay. Another question, Ruby.
Yes, so I guess this is a semi-related question, but we've got Alex asking, what if I can't afford to buy an investment property with high land content?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of different ways of getting more land content than you realise, I think, Alex. And, and sometimes our answer to that would be, if your budget is fairly modest and there's really nothing in Melbourne that has the sort of land content that would be valuable, is to look at other locations, and it might be a regional city like an Albury Wodonga or a Launceston or a Ballarat, Geelong. So that's one option.
Certainly, I've had clients who have bought, and you'd have to have a look at the time, but Adelaide and Perth have got much lower entry points,
Right.
but there's some good capital growth opportunities.
In some of them, yes, although Adelaide, generally the population growth is struggling. So, what I like about the regional cities, again, is the ones that have strong population growth. But the alternative is to understand there's different types of land content. It's not always obvious. So, we've looked at a lot of villas in the outer suburbs.
I was going to say, Glen Ebor Avenue is a good example.
Right.
I mean, we're only talking about 150 square metres there, but it's well located and desirable land, scarce land. So,
and that's still 5 times as much land content as Dandenong Road.
Exactly right. So it doesn't have to be hundreds and hundreds of square metres. A well-located villa in an outer suburb can be bought for modest budgets these days, but still will give
and we've seen, in the inner suburbs, some of the period apartments where there's a smaller block on a good-sized block of land.
Absolutely.
There's some scarcity in terms of the period charm of the building.
That's right.
And if something's got a courtyard or something like that, its effective land content can be quite decent.
Well, we looked at one quite recently in Armidale where it was a ground floor apartment with a really oversized courtyard, so large you could actually park your car in your courtyard for your apartment. So there's different ways of buying land, and it doesn't have to just be the biggest chunk of land, but it can be an apartment or a villa or a townhouse, but one that has a decent land component.
And again, the better located, the more unusually good the land, it's okay to buy a smaller amount of it
Yeah.
because it's still going to appreciate really quickly.
That's right.
Yeah. So thanks everyone for joining us, both the live audience and people who are watching this subsequently. We're called Longview for a reason. Property investment is a long game, and to be really successful in property investment, the single most important thing is that you've got to buy the right property. And so we're spending more of our time these days, Mark, just working with clients to help them do that.
That's right.
In some cases, if they've bought the wrong property or a property that's what we call a slow train, then it's worth getting out of that property and changing to a fast train.
You can see the benefits of buying the right one.
You know, if you'd sold Dandenong Road 3 years in and bought Pascoe Vale or something like it,
Yeah.
it would have cost you a bit of money at the time and it would have felt not so good, but boy, 10 years later, you would have been so thankful that you did that. So anything that we can help you with, it costs nothing to have a chat. We'd love to sit down and talk with you about where you are in your property investment journey, understand your objectives, understand your circumstances, look at your properties that you own or are hoping to buy in detail, and then help you have the tools to be successful in making good property investment decisions, and particularly good purchasing decisions, because they'll be the most important decisions you'll ever make. Thanks again for joining us.